Hi there, this is Mo Volans for Mac Pro Video, and we're going to be taking a look at mixing and mastering in Reason. And this is really for those of you who already are familiar with Reason and its feature set and use it regularly, but want to take your mixes and your masters to the next level. So regardless of what style you're working with, you know, whether you're working with like a band's project like this one that was recorded here in Reason, or something more electronic, beat-based or chill-out stuff, and we will be looking at those sort of projects in contrast to what you're hearing now. But regardless of what style you're working with, it's really best to have some great tips and tricks under your belt to take things to the next stage. And that's what I'm going to be showing you across the next 30 or so tutorials in this course. And we're going to be concentrating on all sorts of techniques, how to use Reason's effects and routing and console to get the best out of your mixes. I'll also be looking at mastering, and you can see here in this track we've got plenty of things going on. We've got plenty of parallel channels, group channels. Anything here with a red fader is a group channel. And also we've got plenty of MIDI as well. So we've got MIDI instruments and samplers and effects, even some pitch correction and mastering processes here as well. So we're going to be looking at all of this. But before we do that, I'm going to actually show you how to strip back and go back to the stage where you will have just imported your tracks or your audio from a recording, whether you recorded it in Reason or whether you recorded it in another DAW. But I'm going to show you essentially how to organize your tracks and how to organize your audio and the mixer, the console, to get the best start really, and ensure that you've got a really quick overview anytime you look at your mixer of exactly what's going on. And you'll thank me for this, because we're going to be looking at some pretty advanced mixing techniques with lots of parallel channels and group buses and plenty of different inserts and combinators. And the last thing you want to do is get bogged down in a mix that is a little overcomplicated and unorganized. So that's what we're going to be looking at next, organization and workflow. Then we're going to move on to how to consolidate and self-contain your project in case you move it to another machine. And then we'll get right into some advanced techniques. In the last tutorial, we took a look at a project that I'd started to mix, and it was starting to get to the point where it was sounding pretty good. But let's rewind a little bit and go back to the start. So say you were at the point that we are here, and we've got everything imported and all our audio files are in the right place and our MIDI's in the right place, and we've got everything thrown into the project. Now we've either done this by drag and drop, or we've used the import menu here, so for MIDI and audio. And I'm sure you've already done this plenty of times, so you'll be aware how to get your audio into the project. But as you can see, things are a bit of a mess at the minute, and they're all different colors. Things are named correctly because when we dropped the audio in, obviously the name of the audio track was given to the name of the channel here. So if we look at our mixer, we've got the same sort of story. Okay, it's named pretty clearly, and I've actually changed the names of some of the drums here, but some of the keys channels here and this channel here for the strings is named, you know, pretty generically. So it's not really clear at first glance what's going on. And also the coloring is default. So when you make a new channel or a new track in the mixer, you automatically get a new color, and Reason decides what that is. They're all different, but they're pretty dull. So what I'd like to do is concentrate on workflow a little bit before we get right into the technique. So let's look at 2 or 3, maybe 4 techniques that you can use that are really going to help you here and clear things up. So first of all, what I like to do is put things in order. And in the last update, you were able to drag things around, and you can do that now in the mixer. You can just drag these wherever you like. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is get all the drums consecutive in the mixer. So let's grab the floor tom and the high tom. And then I'm going to go with bass, that's in the right place. And then let's go with keys. And that's this channel, and then strings, and then sax at the end. So there you go. Straight away, we've got all our drums on the left-hand side here. So we can quickly solo or locate the kick and the snare. And I put them pretty much in the order that you would record a kit or mic up a kit. And that's one way of quickly organizing things. And then you want to make sure the names are correct. Now they're fine for the drums because I've already named them kick, snare, floor tom, bass is fine. But here we go. Let's call this piano, and let's call this strings. Now this seems pretty obvious, but when you've got maybe 2 or 3 times the amount of tracks that you've got here, especially when we start adding parallels, which I'm going to do later in the course, you want to stick to this, because if you don't name things, you might start getting confused where something is. Next up, let's look at coloring. Now, I like to color all the drums or the bass or whatever the same colors. So we can select multiple channels by hitting Shift and selecting a channel. And then we can right click and go to track color. Let me do it a little higher up here. Okay, great. And I'm going to choose red for the drums. Now that's just the color I use, but obviously you could use whatever you want. Now I'll use blue for bass. Now what I'd suggest is that you start to get a little system going. Let's go with steel blue. And piano and strings, I'm going to color yellow. Again, I'll do it up here so you can see the color list. And then sax, we'll color a slightly different tone of yellow. Let's go with orange, in fact. Great. So if we continue to use these colors throughout the project, you know that quickly by looking at yellow, you're looking at piano and strings, looking at orange, you're looking at sax. So even the sub-channels or any parallel channels that we create at a later date can be colored in the same way, and they're quickly identifiable. Now, if we go to our sequencer, things are starting to look a little clearer. But if you want to take things a step further, you can also color the parts. So we can go to clip color, and we can go to red, and we can just repeat the process that we just applied to the tracks there in the mixer. Now, I'll do that in my own time, so you don't have to watch me color every single clip, but you can see straight away that we're getting something much clearer. We've got our names in place, we've got our colors in place, and the mixer is now in the right order. So to me, this is a much, much more organized and professional way of setting up your projects. Now, when you're finished doing that, ensure that you save it. I'm just using Command and S here on the Mac, but obviously if you wanted to, you could go to Save As, and just save over the top of the project that you've just created. But once that's done, we're ready to start mixing. But before I do that, I wanted to show you something called self-containment settings. And this is really important if you plan to take your project to another studio or mix it on another machine. With our project nicely organized and colored and arranged, we're ready to actually save it. And we probably want to do this before we start applying mix processes and busing and parallel channels, just so that we've got this to fall back on in case we go astray in the mix and we're not too happy with the results. We can always come back to this point. What I'd suggest as well is that you ensure that the self-contained settings are correct. Now, what are self-contained settings? Well, essentially, when a Reason project is saved, all the audio you use is automatically saved. But maybe some patches from third-party refills and also samples from other locations that you've used that aren't part of the factory or orchestra sound bank might not be saved. And this is really crucial because if you take your project to another studio or you want to mix it on another computer, you want to ensure that everything comes along for the ride and everything's included when you load it up. So to make sure this happens, you want to go to self-contained settings. Just to show you quickly, when you do save a new project, if we call this version 2 and we save it right on the desktop, you'll notice that a file progress bar will come up and we can see the 621 megabytes of audio there. And that's saved right into the project file so that when we look at the project, that is actually going to be quite a large file, 653 megabytes. So unlike other DAWs that require you to do this as a separate step, this is automatically done within Reason. So you don't have to worry too much about the audio we're using. That is in fact automatically taken care of for you. What you do have to worry about is the self-contained settings that I was talking about before. And you can see I've used a Triton patch. Now it's saying that I've used sounds from the orchestra sound bank, and that's grayed out. That's because to run Reason, you have to have that installed. So on the other end, at the new computer, that's automatically going to be taken care of because that has to be there. But it is showing you that that's been included. But at the same time, I've used an acoustic grand piano from a Triton bank, and this is from the core Triton, and it was just to show you that we need to self-contain this. Now you can see it's unticked. So by default, this wouldn't be included. So this wouldn't load up on the other end. So if I tick it, we can see it's going to add 6.8 megabytes to our project on the other end. So we're going to hit OK, and you can see a little spinning wheel there. Now when I save this, and if I go version 3, just to give it a different name, it's going to be slightly bigger. It'll be around 7 megabytes bigger. But of course, if you've got a lot of instruments like this, you'll want to self-contain all of them, and you can actually check all in that box. So with everything taken care of in this area, with our audio included and our self-contained settings all sorted, we can rest easy and know that it's going to open in any studio, because that might be something that quite a lot of you are doing, taking your projects to other studios to mix. With all of our workflow stuff in place, we're now ready to start mixing and thinking about the relative mix and the first steps we need to take care of before we get into processing. So we're going to move into the next chapter, and I'm going to look at normalization and gain alteration. So where does the mix process start? Well, it starts at source. And what does this mean? Well, it means that you have to get the files right and the audio right that you're using before you even touch a fader and a processor. If you get it wrong at this stage, and even as far back as the recording, there will be problems that have to be addressed, and we'll find out about this later as we start to look at the files individually. But for the minute, we're going to work with this band's recording here because it gives us the best idea of how to manipulate audio. Later, we'll look at electronic projects, and I'll show you similar techniques with this sort of file and electronic instruments. But for the minute, we'll concentrate on this audio. And what do we need to do? Well, we need to check that everything is in the best state possible and that it's firing on all cylinders, if you like. And straight away, just giving this project a quick overlook, we can see that there are a few things that need sorting out. The first thing I want to concentrate on is gain alteration and normalization. In Reason, there's something called non-destructive gain alteration, which is really useful. And what this means is that you can adjust the gain of any file without permanently imprinting this change onto the audio itself. So, for instance, we've got this floor tom file here, and it's really, really quiet, and I'm going to want to gate this later on, and we're going to change the dynamics of it just so we reduce this background noise. I'll just play it back. It's soloed at the minute, and you can hear that we've got a lot of leakage from the other drum mics, and then when the toms fire, there we go, we need to isolate these sections. But for the minute, we just need to get it up to level because it's very, very quiet, which just means that the gain might have been turned down on the mic itself. Now, when you select a part, you'll see this line, and it looks sort of like an automation line, but what it's for is it's for using this non-destructive editing of the gain and inducing fade-ins and fade-outs. So by grabbing this handle here, we can just quickly change the gain, and obviously this is such a quiet file that we can reduce it right down to silence quite easily, but we can turn it up, and you can see the change immediately in the file. And if we want to induce a fade-in, we grab the handles at the start, and you can see that fade-in occurring. Now, it's going to be much more evident if we grab something that's louder. You can see the fade there. And it's a really great way of inducing a fade in or a fade out with even hitting any sort of sample editor. And it's totally non-destructive, so you can change this at any time. And if something's too loud, just turn it down. And you can see that change happen immediately. And you can see if there's going to be clipping, because if it gets to the outer edge of the boxes of the event, you know you're going to get some kind of clip. With this file, it's not quite getting loud enough, or we're having to push that all the way up. There is something we can do. If I right-click on the file itself, you'll see a couple of options for editing the audio, and normalize clips is one of them. Now, you can do this here in the edit mode, or you can do it in the arrange screen. It really makes no difference, but as soon as I go to normalize, it's going to process the file for us, and we can go back to song mode. And there's our process file. And now we can adjust this to taste with our level adjuster here. So that's perfect. And what you really want to do is go through all your files and do this exact process and normalize what needs normalizing. I mean, I wouldn't suggest normalizing every file, because if these are, say, at 60 or 70% and they were recorded with a decent amount of headroom, there's really no need to normalize everything. You don't want everything firing at 0 dB. You'll only end up having to change your relative mix. And, although normalization doesn't apply any processing, there is an argument that applying this much mathematical alteration to your files can affect your sound. I'm not convinced, but it might be better to leave things alone if they don't need alteration. Here, for example, we can go through the same process, and I can go to normalize clips right here in the arrange window, and it's going to do exactly the same thing. It's just going to process the entire file for us, and then we can change this to taste. And this is going to be much better to gate, because it's going to feed any dynamics processes with more level. We're going to get a much healthier signal. So there you go. There's manual gain alteration and fade in and fade outs, and also normalization. Using these two things in conjunction with each other is a really great tool for getting your files up to exactly the right volume before you hit your mix. Next up, I'm going to show you something called manual dynamics control. That's at least what I like to call it. And it's really for adjusting files that are quiet in some parts and loud in others. So we're busy prepping our audio files, ready to plunge ourselves into the mix and our mixing session. And we've taken a look at the audio handles, the handles that we use on each of the audio files to adjust level and to induce fade-ins and fade-outs. And these are great for applying quick, non-destructive edits to any of our audio files. And we looked at that in the last tutorial. Now I want to show you a different method for creating non-destructive edits, and something that's perfect for changing gain levels and levels of your audio before you feed them through dynamics processing. So if we take a look at the sax here, we can see that even in the first half here, we've got very different levels, and we've got a sort of a pretty large dynamic range. I'm going to zoom in on the section I'm talking about. we've got these very quiet sections. Now, do remember that this isn't mixed at all. There's no processing going on. We haven't even done our relative mix. So try and bear with me at this point because it's pretty rough. But you can hear the sax at this point is really, really low. And this could be anything. This could be a vocal, a lead. And it happens a lot with live playing. Obviously, the sax player was laying back off the mic, or he was just playing very quietly. And in this section here, he turned the volume up, moved closer to the mic, and we've got a much more present sound. Now, we could feed this all through a compressor, and we are going to do that. But before we go straight to the dynamics processor, there's some work we can do to ensure it's not going to work too hard. Because if you push a dynamics processor over about 5 or 6 decibels, you're going to get some pretty nasty artifacts. So we want to try and keep this transparent. So if we change the level a little bit ourselves at this point, our processors aren't going to have to work quite as hard, which can only be a good thing. So let's take a look at what we've got to do. Let's get to the mixer, and we're going to go to the sax. And I'm just going to use automation. I'm going to do what's called riding the level, except I'm going to actually automate this riding. And to do that, I've got to create an automation track. Now, the best way to do it is to just right-click on anything in the console or anything in Reason and click Edit Automation. And what this is going to do is immediately create an automation lane in the channel that we want to adjust. And once we've done that, we can start to draw some automation in. Now, there are a couple of ways we can do this. We can manually draw in the automation, or we can record it in. Now, I'm going to show you both methods. To manually draw it in, just draw a part across the area that you want to automate. And I'll just go through the next quiet part here. And what we want to do is keep the volume high in this section and then dip it in this section. So go back to the arrow tool and double click our automation part, and this is going to come up. And this is where we can draw our automation in, and we're going to use the pencil tool, and we're just going to start drawing and then dip it here. And it doesn't have to be exact because we can edit this, and you're going to see there's going to be some reduction in our information. I mean, you can draw as much as you want, and we're going to get a pretty large reduction of data, and it gives you sort of an overview of what you've drawn. So let's have a listen to this, and like I say, it doesn't have to be exact at this point. Let's solo the sax. So I want it to be quieter a little sooner. So the phrase ends there. And we don't want things to dip too much, so we can edit these points. You can delete them just by clicking them and pressing backspace. But this is essentially what a compressor would be doing, just with a little more control. Great, so something like that is going to give us a quieter section. And obviously, you know, keep experimenting with it so it's transparent. You don't want to hear any volume changes. And when you're finished, that can either be exported or you can just leave it as is so you can change it later. Now, another way to get the automation data in is to actually record it in. And this gives you something to work with. And I quite like to work in this way. So we can play back, we can hit record and ensure that the record automation light is on here. You can see that's record enable parameter automation. And we can actually change it ourselves. And you can see that red highlighted area as I move the fader. And again, it's going to, when we hit record again, it's going to reduce the amount of data. So don't worry too much about all that data being present. And so what we can do is we can hit record coming up to the section that we want, and we can dip it. And this is quite a good way to get it exact. And that's often a better way than drawing it in because it gives you the exact right point where you should be by the time the instrument comes in. Great. And you can see that was probably faster than drawing it in, and it gives us a better result. So you can try both of those methods, and it's a good idea to do this before you apply dynamics processing. By the time we've finished this, we should have less of a massive dynamic range, and there should be less of a difference between the louder sections and the quieter sections, and therefore we'll be driving our compressor a little less. And like I say, this is only a good thing. Next up, I'm going to show you the importance of getting a quick relative mix and how this can be an important step before you start applying serious processing. We're just about to enter the final few stages of preparation and fault correction before we hit our actual mix. But before we do that, I think at this stage it's really important to get a good, solid relative mix. Now, what do I mean by relative mix? Currently, you can see that all the faders are at unity gain or 0 dB. So when we play this back, we're really just going to hear the level of the audio that was recorded or imported straight into Reason. So if you recorded a band session like this one in a few different places, the things are going to be at different levels. So you're going to hear some very loud bass or very loud snare drum, but really quiet piano or whatever. And if you've got MIDI, the level of the instrument's going to not really relate very well to the level of the live recorded instruments. It's going to be the same in an electronic project. If you just drag a load of files in, they're really not going to have any relation to each other, and we're going to have a poor relative mix. So to get this started, we really need to sort of think about things in groups. We're not going to actually create any group channels yet, but I'm going to maybe mix the drums, the bass, and the piano, and the sax. And this is not really going to be the final mix. This is just a solid relative mix for us to work with while we apply our initial processing and also start to look for faults and any problems. So what I'm going to do is mix down the instruments, and I'm also going to mix down the stereo pair for the drums here. And we're going to just go back to the beginning of our project and play back sort of the body of the drums. Now, like I said before, things aren't processed here, so it's going to sound very dry and, a little lackluster. But what we can get from this is where things should be, more or less. Now, what I'm getting here is that there's quite a lot of leakage coming out of these tom mics. So we know, for instance, in doing this, that we're going to need to process that out and fix it. So in completing your relative mix, you're also going through and looking for faults and problems in any of the audio files and making notes possibly for things you need to do later. Now, I know that this is a stereo pair, so I'm going to have to pan these, and sorting your relative mix out is going to be initial alterations like this and balancing these stereo mics here. I'm not even going to apply any EQ at this point. I can hear this snare needs a lot of work, but at this point, I'm just going to keep things very, very simple. I'm going to pan these toms slightly. Now, we're already starting to get, a sort of a very vague picture of what it's going to be like. And now I can start mixing in the rest of the rhythm section. Now, regardless of what genre you're working in, even if you're working on a full-on electronic track, you can use this same process just to get an initial picture of your mix. And one other thing we're looking for here, and you can notice that I've got the master faders in peak mode. You can change the mode here by just hitting this mode button. You can actually have one mode on one fader and another on the right. I'm just using peak all the way. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that I've got at least a couple of decibels of headroom before it hits 0 dB or any clips. Okay. So even at that louder section there, we know we've not really got any clipping. And that's much better. And that only took a couple of minutes. That's much better than we had with everything at 0 dB. And that's with no processing, no real sort of mix technique, just some simple placement of the faders and a couple of movements on the pan controls. And I think that gives us a lot more to work with. We can hear the band as they were playing, how it was meant to be in the room. And from this point, we have a very, very good foundation for stepping forward, applying processing. And in the next couple of videos, I'm going to be looking for faults and applying any fades and trims that we need to apply before we move on and start applying some processors and plugins here. When you're right at the start of a mixing session like this, you're going to be bringing a load of new audio parts in and performances and recordings. And at this point, or in fact any other point in the project, you might want to alter the timing of a performance, the length of a performance, or the timing of the entire project. And there's quite a few different ways to do this in Reason, and I wanted to show you a few tips and tricks you can use to start altering the actual timing of performances before you start mixing them. Now, what I've done is I've exported the entire drum group into one audio file, and we can see the result down here. And it's basically just everything but the tom mics. So you've got the kick, the snare, and the ambient mics. And remember, again, it's not processed, but what we've got here is a very raw drum recording. There's a little bit of a click at the end just because it's live and we've got a little bit of the next hit here. But it's going to be really useful for demonstrating these techniques. Now, overall, we can change the tempo of the entire project if we want to. And what this will do is change the tempo of every piece of audio or MIDI that's playing at that time. In fact, the entire project will be time stretched. And Reason actually has one of the best time stretch algorithms that's out there at the minute. It's not always been like this, but right now Reason is right there amongst the best. So if we go from 162 to say 140 and play back, the loop is automatically time stretched. Now, if I undo that and go back to the original, you can see that it's automatically updated in real time. Now, if we didn't want this to occur, I could go back to the song mode and I could right click and tick disable stretch. I'll just do that again. And now it says enable stretch. But if I disable it and change the tempo to 140, it remains at the same speed. So if you wanted to import a load of performances or audio files in, and then you wanted to change the tempo, but you didn't want certain files to change in your project, you would take this and make sure that it didn't change. For instance, when I first started this project, I imported everything in, or some extra parts that had been recorded elsewhere, and I didn't want them to change when I was adjusting the tempo. And I just made sure that this was enabled for some parts and disabled for others. And this meant that everything was locked perfectly in time. Now, there are a couple of other ways that we can change the timing of a performance. We can individually time stretch parts. So if we wanted to change the length of just this part and it wasn't quite 162 or whatever, if I change the length of it like this, it's just going to open up the length of the actual audio part. So if there was any more audio recorded, it's just going to be opened up here, and that isn't going to change the actual length of the part. But if I hit Alt, you see that the icon changes to a small clock, and this is the time stretch mode. With this engaged, once I change the length of the part, you can see that it's actually stretching the whole file. And I can move this to anywhere that I want, in fact, quite a way. Let's change the loop. Now I'm just going to just fade off that little bit at the end. But that's another way of quickly altering the timing of a part. Now, what happens if we want to actually change the groove of a part? Not just the timing, but the arrangement of each hit in a piece of audio. Now, you could split it up into its, separate components manually and place them onto different tracks and move them around that way. But Reason gives us a much better way now to do this. Now, if I double click on the audio file, you can see we've got something very similar to Recycle. And this is essentially what this is. It's Recycle built into Reason. And if you've ever used Recycle, the way it works is it splits the audio up into transients, and these can then be split and moved and edited, and in fact sent to a Dr. Rex player, which we'll be looking at in a later chapter. But for now, this drum part, say I want to move the snares around, we can make sure that the snap is on to say 1/16. And you can move them around until they sound cool. And this can be done with any part. Obviously, we're mangling the loop here a fair bit. but completely changing the groove. Not necessarily for the better, but there you go. That's how you can change the groove or the placement of individual hits within an audio file. So if there's one snare hit that's maybe out in a fill, you could quickly move it, and a bass part, the groove of a bass part could be changed. But that's the three ways of changing timing, realistically. You can disable and enable stretch per clip. You can stretch each clip individually. You can stretch the whole tempo of a project and disable and enable particular clips within that stretch algorithm. And then you can move around the segments of a dynamic part in this way once it's been analyzed with this internal Rex type engine. For the final part of this chapter, I just wanted to show you that we really should concentrate on putting fades in the right places and fixing faults. You can see in this loop, for example, if this was in the project, I'd be fixing this loop and taking out this little byte transient here at the end. But I'm going to just quickly trim off any parts of the audio and any noise or room noise that we don't want. And we can make sure that once we start processing that these aren't going to be amplified and present in our mix. As with any audio recording or collection of audio files, occasionally you're going to find faults and problems that need to be solved before you start mixing them. And this project's pretty clean and it's turned out pretty well, but there are some things that I'd like to tighten up before we get going. Now, some of these are going to involve fades and some of them are going to involve trimming, and we're even going to start applying some of our initial processing here to gate out some noise. Now, right at the beginning, for instance, we've got some count-in hats that I want to get rid of. And this is the sort of thing, that you want to sort of address before you get going. And it's best that if you're going to start trimming things that you trim all the audio files that you're using. So you can see these count-in hats are just easily removed by just trimming that start section there. And I will just take the solo off that I've got going here. And play back the result. That's great. So that's one problem sorted already. And then right at the end, I think there's some noise on the bass that I caught. And these are really minor problems, but you want to get them sorted before you start limiting things and making these issues louder. So we can trim this and we can apply the fade that I showed you right at the beginning. And then we can solo the bass and just make sure it's a clean ending. Nothing wrong with a bit of live sound, but you don't really want any clicks and pops. Now, this can be the case with digital files, that exports of audio instruments, software instruments, or recordings. You really want to look out for clicks, pops, faults, and I've gone through every single audio file and everything's fine. One problem I did notice, however, was that the tom track or the tom mics are pretty loud. They were mixed pretty loud, and the toms were pretty quiet. So we've got not a huge amount of difference between the leakage in the tom and the tom itself. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Right here, you can sort of see the audio file is pretty loud throughout. And the toms, there is some impact, but we want to make sure that we're not getting this leakage all the way throughout the track. And it's the same with the high tom and the low tom. And I'm going to put them together so you can see what I mean. So realistically, what we want to do is we want to gate this noise out. Now, what we can use is the actual console dynamics section. And I'm going to go right to that now. And if we just scroll up the mixer, you can see here, we've got a dynamics section and below it a gate. And the gate's the one we're going to want to use. And I'm going to attack the floor tom first. So let's solo that and mix it up. Now I'm going to play you without the gate first, and you'll be able to hear what I mean. And I'll be able to show you the problem that we're having. So this is the leakage that we can hear right now. And we don't really want this because the overhead mics and the direct snare mics and the kick mics are already picking this up with no problem. What we actually want is the tom hit itself. There we go. So it's quite subtle, but we can actually isolate this because it's louder than the noise bed, than the noise floor. So let's go back to the mixer here. And now we're going to switch the gate on. And I want the reduction at the beginning to be pretty intense. So we're going to go minus 30 odd dB. And then what we need to do is start tuning the threshold. Now, at the minute, you can see that the gate is on because you're seeing all these green lights, and that's the gain reduction. So we're getting a full whack of gain reduction there. I've got the hold on 0, and I'm going to leave the release at its default value. Now, if we put fast attack on, this means that it's able to snap into fast transients. And because we're using drums, we really want to switch that on so that the gate quickly opens up when the tom hits. Now, we can see at the minute, the gate's sort of flashing on and off, and this is no good, really. We really want to completely eradicate this noise. So what we need to do is change the threshold. Now we've got silence more or less, and we want to just keep going until all these hits don't trigger the gate. All we want to trigger the gate is the tom itself. There you go. That triggered it fine. But there is another problem. It cuts off far too fast. So we really want to increase the release until it sounds a little bit more realistic. Maybe a little bit more. That's much better. And now we can hear the other hits. And you are going to get a bit of leakage, but it's much better. And we're really not going to get all that leakage and all those problems. And now what we can do is we can sort of copy the settings that we just used onto the high tom. And this will at least be a great starting point. It may not be exactly right, but we can be sure that it's going to be close enough. So let's solo that as well now. We should be able to see both these gates working. So you can see both of those are now triggering nicely. And although they need some EQ, we fixed that problem with those files. So there's some trimming and some fades and some gating to attack the last problems in our audio files. And now we're ready to start applying some serious processing. So we've got our project organized and colored and all our faults ironed out. And we've even done some gating on some of the drums to ensure there's not too much leakage on a couple of the mics. Now, there's not too many channels here, but there's something that we can do to improve the sound straight away. Grouping channels is really important. And although there's really only one group of instruments in this mix, I'm going to show you how grouping can really help straight away. So let's grab all the drums, and I'm just using Shift to grab them here. And as soon as we've done that, we can right-click on any of these channels. And we can go to Route 2, New Output Bus. Now, as soon as we do that, this group channel appears, and you can tell it's a group channel from the red fader and the colouring of the background. Now, we can choose the output, and at the minute it's going to the master, and that's exactly where we want it to go. So all this means is that all our drums are going into this channel, and then they're all going out into the master. This does a couple of things. It allows us to control the level of the drums overall, and it also allows us to treat the drums as one single entity. Now notice that every channel that's been fed into this group has now got a little bus 1 thing below it, and you can choose here exactly which bus you want to go to. So if you set up another bus and you wanted to feed, say, the toms into another bus, you can easily reroute them. And you can also create a new output bus from here. So if we wanted to do that, we could just have our toms go into bus 2, and then bus 2 can go into bus 1. So essentially that's a group into a group. So if you wanted to mix the toms as their own sort of single channel going into bus 1, which is our drum group, and we'll name that now. I'd tend to shorten them slightly just so it fits in a single line, but you can name them exactly what you want. And now we can control the sound of the drums, or the level of the drums at least at the moment, with one single fader. Now, as we move along the mix, we're going to start creating what's called parallel channels. And we're going to move into that in the next couple of tutorials. And when we do this, these parallel channels can then be grouped into their own groups. So if you had several parallel channels feeding out of these drums, we can feed them into this master drum group or into sub drum groups like we've got here for our toms. Now, we've only really got one piano at the minute, but let's say we wanted to layer another piano on top of this. How do we go about doing that, and how do we group it? Okay, so let's go to the rack here, and I'm going to create a brand new instrument. I'm going to go with an NNXT, and There's a grand piano right at the start. We'll obviously want to change this sound, but we're currently using an ID8, which is very standard general MIDI style piano. So the NNXT will probably provide a bit of a fuller sound. And we can also layer this with the original piano. What we'll need to do next is actually duplicate the MIDI. So let's zoom out a little bit so we can see the entire picture. And there are our keys currently. And there's our NNXT. And I'm just going to copy these down. When you do this, make sure that you've got snap on a reasonably large value, just so that they snap down nicely. And now we should be able to go back to the mixer. And there's our second piano track. So I'm going to call this Piano 2, or you can call it Piano Layer, whatever you like. And we're going to select both of them with Shift. Then we're going to click on the output, and we're going to go to New Output Bus. And now we can feed this to the same bus. And both the pianos are going to our new piano bus. So we can call this Piano, or Pianos. And if we want to compress them or equalize them or affect them, we can do them straight through this bus channel. And we can get our relative mix of the pianos here. So let's take a listen. Of course, you can solo both pianos. Great. So now we've got a subgroup and two main groups for our main instruments. So that's how you create group channels. And of course, you can do that with anything you like, groups of vocals, groups of guitars, effects. And it's equally as useful in electronic music as it is in band mixes. And it's a really welcome addition to our mix as we move forward. Next, we're going to take a look at parallel processing and creating parallel channels. But before we move into it, I'm going to show you what parallel groups actually are, what parallel channels actually are, and how you create them in Reason. In the next couple of tutorials, I'm going to show you the importance of parallel processing and how it can really help you in both mixing bands and electronic projects. I'm going to show you some examples in both of those styles, and I'm going to show you just how great it is in Reason, how easy it is to achieve a fuller sound through parallel processing. But before I do that, I sort of wanted to show you what it is and how it's created in Reason. We've just looked at groups, and it's really straightforward to create a group, and it's just as straightforward to create a parallel, but there are real differences between the two. And even if you're a seasoned Reason user, you might get mixed up between the two. So I thought I'd clarify it a little bit for you. Essentially, a group channel is a number of channels being fed into a single channel. And a parallel channel is really just a duplicate of any one of those channels. It could be a parallel of a group. It could be a parallel of a single sound or a single instrument. But it is a mirror image copy of that sound. And the beauty of the way it's done in Reason is that it's a mirror image before any processing takes place. So it's before the mixer. So if you can imagine scrolling to the top of the mixer before the gain inputs, the parallel routing takes place up here somewhere. So it doesn't actually happen post EQ or post effects. So what this means is if you create a group channel or a single channel with a lot of processing on it and a lot of sends and equalization and panning and automation and everything else, when you create your parallel, it's completely dry. It doesn't include all of that processing. And this is great because in other DAWs, you can create a parallel by creating a send. So in Logic, for example, or Cubase, you can create a send and return. But obviously this sends everything you've just processed. And there are other problems as well. If you mute the original channel, you don't hear the second channel. In Reason, it doesn't work like this. It works like it does on an analog console. You create a parallel channel, you create a mirror image of the dry audio or dry signal path. Let's have a look at what I mean. So let's say we wanted to create a parallel of our drum group. Let's click on it and scroll down to create parallel channel. Now, it gets no more complex than that. That's as easy as it is to create a parallel channel, but it doesn't really stop there. There are other things you need to know. First up, when you create a parallel channel, you'll see that they're indented. So I didn't actually create a parallel of the drum group, sorry, I created a parallel of the toms. So this indentation shows, well, one or two things, that you've created a parallel of this channel and that these are parallel channels. So if you see this indentation, you know that this is a parallel grouping or parallel creation in this area. Let's undo that, and I'm actually going to create a parallel of the drum track again. So let's do it again, right click, right click in the right area and go to create parallel channel. And again, you can see straight away that we've got this indentation. And the parallel group is called P1, which is the first parallel. I mean, you can rename this to whatever you want, but it's quite a cool naming system and it's very clear. So as soon as we've got this parallel channel, we can mix it up and down however we want, and it's not going to affect the original group. So let me solo the original group. In fact, I'm going to take all solos off. That's a useful little shortcut down here, by the way. If you've got a lot of different solos and you can't be bothered to go all the way through and unsolo them all, you can just click solo all off down here, and the same with your mute all off as well. So quite a nice little shortcut. So let's solo the drum group. And I'm going to solo the parallel as well. And all that's going to do at the minute is make it louder because we've got two dry parallel groups. But as I turn down the original group, we still hear the parallel. So it really is just a mirror image of our drum group. And this gives us a lot of freedom. We can then process this, we can then EQ it, we can do exactly what we want with it. We can route it anywhere we like, we can send it to effects. And I'm going to show you in the next couple of tutorials exactly how powerful this system is. It may seem like a very straightforward process, but you can make a great number of these throughout a mix, and we're going to be doing that. And you can really get a much fuller and more powerful sound through parallel processing. So we've taken a good look at how you can create parallel channels in Reason and what they actually are, but now we're going to see how you can use them in the mix. And I'm going to concentrate on probably one of the most important areas that you can use parallel processing on, and that's drums. It tends to work really well with drums. Of course, you can use it with any instrument, but it just seems to work even better with drums. So I'm going to show you parallel processing with this band session that we have, and then I'm going to move on to an electronic project and do the same technique, repeat the same technique, but you're going to see it with two different styles and how you can get differing effects. So we've got our drum group, and all of our drums are going into this drum group here, apart from our toms, which are going into their own subgroup, and that's also into the drum group. So everything is being fed into here. So I'm going to solo the drums, and we're just going to play that back. Now you can hear the relative levels were mixed earlier, but we've got no real processing apart from the gating on the toms, and that's really the only thing that we've got applied so far. So we're working with a really dry drum group, and I think it's going to demonstrate really well how parallel processing can help even with such a simple mix like this. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to create parallel channel. We've already looked at that. And then we're going to see our two indented channels here. And this is the one we're going to use for our processing. This is going to be the dry channel. And this is going to be our process channel. So I'm going to solo this as well, and I'm going to turn it down for the minute. You can hear all we're going to get at this point is phasing because we've got exactly the same thing. What we need to do is start to process this channel. So if we hit rack, you can see it flashing in the rack here. And I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to go to show insert effects. And I'm going to apply some soft tube saturation. And I'm going to go about 75%. Now this is probably much further than you'd go on a standard channel. If I applied that just to the channel, it's going to be too much. So if we listen to this by itself, yeah, it's a bit of a distorted mess. You know, we could knock it back, but we're not going to get the same effect. If I mix that at 15, 20%, we're not going to get the same crunch. And this is obviously too much by itself. But when you start to mix these two sounds together, using mainly the dry channel, and mix this underneath, you get a whole new level of control. And what I like to do is roll some of the bottom end off. So the bottom end isn't interfering with each other. And we can do that with a high pass filter. I'm going to take about 120 hertz off the bottom end. Now we've got a sort of a brighter, crunchy version of the drum loop underneath. So without it, really dynamic, but a little plain. With it, much more energetic. And our dynamic range is also reduced a little bit, so it's easier to control. It's going to be a denser signal. If you want to go a step further, you can also compress this channel. And I'm going to use an M-class compressor here. Drive a load of gain into it. Put some very fast and slow attack and release times on for a bit of a strange effect. And again, if we listen to this by itself, totally smashed. And we can try the other way. Yeah, I like it with full attack and minimum release. These are things you probably wouldn't do when tracking with a standard compressor on a standard channel, but we can really get away with it on a single channel like this. Now when we mix this in, and without it, and it may sound like we're increasing the level of the drums a lot, but in fact it's just a decrease in dynamic range, and it's perceived increase in volume. So we've already increased the energy and the fullness of the loop, and it's definitely more present, and we've reduced the dynamic range. But we've got this control, this element of control by mixing in this parallel channel. Now I'm going to show you the same effect, but with electronic drums, and you can really see how it can work both with acoustic recorded drums and an electronic drum track as well. So here we are in a more electronic project with a house beat, and I've already set up a drum group, as you can see up here. In fact, I'll go straight to the mixer, and I've already set up the parallel channel. Now you've seen me do this twice now in the last two videos, so I didn't think there was any point in going through it again, but it's already set up and it's turned down. So here's our beat as it is. And it's pretty good, it's pretty solid. There's not really a huge amount of processing. There's some EQ on each of the channels, and there's no mastering processing on this. We're just going through a little bit of bus compression. And I've already, like I say, set up the parallel channel, and I've actually gone to the lengths of putting some processing on it already. And I've used the Scream 4 here, and I've used one of my favorite presets, which is the tape setting here, and with a moderate amount of compression and a reasonably bright bias setting. I've also added some high-end EQ and removed some low and left the mids alone. So we've got a brighter, more punched sound on the parallel channel. Currently it's not mixed in, but if we start to mix this in, we can hear how we can make the sound brighter and a little punchier. And by mixing these in, let's just solo this by itself. You can hear it's really overcompressed. I've actually removed some of the low end with a high pass filter. Added a bit of EQ here as well. So now we can just add this brighter version of the loop to taste. And it just adds a little extra energy, a little extra density, and you can set up as many of these as you like. So you could have a deeper one, you could have a wider one, and you can just mix them in. And I'm going to show you how we can work this on individual sounds in the next tutorial, and how we can mix individual bands and frequencies into individual drum sounds. So we've looked at groups and we've looked at parallel processing, and so far they've been used together. So I've been using parallel processing to treat groups. What I want to show you now is how to treat individual sounds with parallel processing and what we can get out of this. It's actually incredibly useful because we can use it in a way like a multi-band processor. So we can dial in deep bass, high end, mid-range, all with separate parallel channels. Now I'll show you that now, and I've gone back to the band session because I think it's going to work really well on the acoustic kit, and it also obviously works well on drum parts that have their individual stems separated rather than processing an entire drum loop. So we're going to concentrate on the kick for now, and I'm going to show you how we can dial in really a deep kick and a high-end kick to complement the kick that we've got now. And this is really an alternative to adding EQ to this channel. We could obviously just add some low end. Let's just get straight to the mixer. We could add some low end here and some high end, but I want to go beyond that, and I want to show you how you can gain some extra control. So straight away, we've got the drum and parallel drum bus soloed, and this is just our parallel channel that we added some saturation to. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to create parallel channel on the kick, and I'm going to do it twice because I know that I want to use at least 2. So we're going to do it twice, and we've got our parallel kicks there. And remember, don't be concerned about any processing or EQ that you've got on your kick drum. Not that we have any here, but say you did have some compression and EQ, you don't need to worry about it because, as I mentioned earlier, these parallel channels will represent a completely dry version and basically take their stream from above the mix channel. So they're pre-channel, pre-fader. So let's just mix these down for the second, and I'm going to call this kick low. Keep it short so it fits in nicely, and kick high. Okay, great. So we know what these are, and we can start to add the processing that we want. And I'm just going to use the inline, the console-based EQ here, and I'm going to go just switch everything on both channels. And on the first one, I'm going to add some low end, quite a lot of low end. I'm going to add a little more EQ here than you probably would in a usual situation, just so that it's very apparent what I'm doing. We can always dial it back down. So the next one's going to have plenty of high end on it. And you're going to see why I'm doing this in a second. So let's listen to the beat here. And let's take everything out but the kick. So there's our standard kick drum mic. And if we listen to the low version, we've obviously got a lot more bottom end. Now what we can also do is filter off some of the top end, so make it even more extreme. So we've just got this sort of sub bass, and we can go even a little lower with the EQ. So we've got a low thud. Now by itself, not extremely useful. But when mixed with the original, let's take it out. We can add some low frequencies without affecting that original sound. And here's our high. And again, here we can filter off some of the low end. And let's solo that. And let's add a little more high end. And if you wanted to, you could gate this because obviously we've got some bleed. So there's our original kick with some low and some high. And in the mix, add a little more saturation. And you can see how we can start to add control to specific sounds. And this would work with an electronic kick drum, so you could layer up an electronic kick drum and make it deeper. You could have one that's wider, that's got a reverb on it maybe, or some effects or some distortion, and just mix that up. And really, you can have as many of these per single sound as you want. There's really not, a limit to the amount you can have. Reason, doesn't decide that you can only have 5 or 10. You can keep going and you can layer it up. And when you finish, you can export it or group it, whatever you like. Now I'm going to go across the mix and I'm going to do this with the snare and as well. And I'm maybe going to add another one to the drum group, and I'll make that apparent in later tutorials. But for now, we're going to take a look at EQ and dynamics in the console and how we can use those to get the best out of our sounds and really squeeze every last ounce of goodness out of our recordings. As we get into our mix, the first things we're going to want to concentrate on are applying groups, applying parallel processing, getting a relative mix, and we've already nailed all that down and the mix is starting to take shape. It's far from finished, but we're getting a little bit of a picture of how it's going to evolve and how it's going to finish up. Now, some of the first pieces of processing that we're going to apply, some of the first types of processing we're going to apply are equalization and dynamics processing. Now, we've already applied a bit of EQ on the parallel kick channels here and a little bit on the drum groups, and there was plenty of EQ applied to the electronic mix that I showed you. But what we have done so far is use the console to apply the EQ, and you can see it's a 4-band parametric system. We've got high mid frequency, low mid frequency, and low frequency, and this is modeled on an SSL console, so very classic in terms of EQ, and it's great to use. It's very simple to use, which these two mid frequency filters are. So we've got quite a lot of control there. But obviously, if you don't come from a hardware background or you've never used this sort of EQ, there is another approach we can use. If you hit this button up here and it says show in Spectrum EQ window, we get this cool little analysis window pop up. Now, by default, it's just an analysis window. So, Spectrum Analyzer, so we can really see what's going on with our sound. This is currently on the drum group. You can see here, it says drum group, and you can actually select whichever sound you want. So if you want to select the whole master, you can see the whole master there. So what more does it do apart from just analyze our sounds and give us an overview? Well, it's actually a representation of the EQ we've got on the console. So this is not a separate EQ. Some people out there may think this is a new EQ on the console, but it's not. It's exactly the same EQ. It's just displaying the information in a slightly different manner. So if we switch the EQ on, you're going to see exactly the same 4 bands, and they're color coded. So if we look at the EQ, and this is this channel here we're looking at with the highlighted spectrum window, we've got our red at the top. This is here. We've got our green, and we've got our blue and our grey black at the bottom. So you can see that this is and you can hear the effect of that. Went a little far with that, but this is a low shelf, and we've got a high shelf up the top. And if I switch the EQ off here, or I change a setting here, it's mirrored in the Spectrum Analyzer window. And it's great because we see this as a high shelf, but now if we change it to bell, you can really see what's going on. And we can get those sweeping effects that maybe weren't so easy, with the dials themselves. So what more can we do here? Well, we can apply low and high pass filters, just as we can here in the filter section. But the difference really is that we see the actual effect of these filters immediately in the let me just turn these off. And by the way, you can actually have the EQ on and the filters off, or vice versa. They are separate modules. So if I turn the EQ off, you can still have the filters on. But you can see the effect that we're having right here in the Spectrum Analyzer. So let's turn these off and let's look at what we need to do. This is the drum group. Now I think there's a bit of a dip here in the high mids. Now if I hit Alt, it says Option drag to set, but if I hit Alt and drag it, you can see I'm changing the Q. And that's the width of the EQ. So I want it reasonably narrow. And maybe a touch of high end as well. And I want to take this high frequency bell off. So now we can quickly turn it on and off and hear and see the effect. Great. So there's the EQ analyzer and Spectrum Analyzer style EQ. And for those of you that come from sort of more modern digital EQs, this is going to be a great way to mix. I like using it. I use both, But, you know, it just really depends on what you're doing. If you really need to dial in on a certain frequency area, it's great to sort of double check it with the spectrum analyzer. So hopefully that's a new angle for you when it comes to equalizing your sounds in Reason. And next up, I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks when it comes to the dynamics side of the console.